Hello and welcome to Chapter 1.1, Orbs in Paranormal Photography. When trying to work out which photographic subject to cover first, I had originally dismissed orbs due to the subject's initial complexity. But then, as I looked at it, I figured why not kick the project off with dealing head-on with one of the more controversial topics in alleged paranormal evidence methodology. So, to pose a question, are orbs the visual manifestation of a spirit or ghost? The first stage to looking at this is observations. Beyond the first simple issue of the existence of spirits and ghosts having not yet been proven, i.e. the question would be moot if spirits and ghosts do not actually exist, then other causal factors must first be examined, primarily the environment in which the photographs are taken and the photographic processes and technology used. Orbs are a source of massive disagreement when it comes to collating evidence of the paranormal. I've seen screaming, shouting and threatening behaviour by believers in the phenomenon when dealing with those like myself who debunk those little circles of light as nothing more than photographic artefacts. Looking back at photography history, the first suggestion of orbs being of paranormal origin seems to have been in the early 1990s, which was then thoroughly debunked in 1994 by Joel Nickell in his book Camera Clues, a handbook for photographic investigation. Initially, it must be said that by the very definition of the term paranormal, as in something not explainable by known science, orbs are not paranormal, as the photographic processes whereby they are formed in photography are well documented, tested and can be replicated. Now for those that don't know, orbs are small blobs or circles of light that appear on photographs. They can be all sizes, occasionally different shapes, sometimes coloured, in some cases appear to be textured. Through the process of pareidolia, can be seen to contain faces or similar. But before we delve further, a little bit of personal background and admissions in the subject first. The first photographs I took on my very first digital camera in 2003 were actually during a ghost hunt at the rather impressive Chillingham Castle in Northumberland. It was the first ghost hunting event I'd ever been on, and after the investigation, when I was reviewing the images on my camera, I noticed something strange. Small blobs of light on some of the photographs. It wasn't something I'd seen before on film photography, apart from when the flash from the camera hit falling rain, but in the case of the investigation these odd little blobs were on images photographed indoors and in dry weather. So I contacted the investigation group that I'd been a guest of, and to my surprise and naive delight, they explained that what I'd caught was evidence of a paranormal phenomenon known as orbs and the beginning manifestation of a spirit. Naturally, capturing such wonderful proof on my first foray into official investigation was something to be celebrated. That year I began my research and investigations, which ultimately led to my book Otherworld Northeast, Ghosts and Hauntings Explored, being published in October of 2004. And in the book, photographic proof of the paranormal in the form of orbs. Obviously now I regard this as a facepalm moment, but as with most things in life, it often requires mistakes being made for progress to be made in turn. As time progressed, the group I'd pulled together to undertake the field investigations for the book continued to operate as Otherworld Northeast, investigating a wide variety of locations across the Northeast. At the same time, in my day job, there was the very slow transition into digital photography, and I began to get more suspicious of orbs with their habit of mostly appearing in dusty or damp conditions, or more spectacularly in clouds of insects. So as any self-respecting investigator does, if something doesn't seem right, you investigate it, which was something I began to do, and it soon became very clear that orbs were not in fact the dead trying to manifest. They were simply photographic artefacts that had mundane, and well known within the professional photographic community, causes. Some would say the explanation, however, is a dusty reed. An important observation to make is literally the air around us. The major components of air are gases, primarily nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, argon, water vapour, and other trace gases such as ammonia, hydrogen, methane, and nitrogen dioxide. But as well as the gases, air also contains what is classed as particulate matter. This material includes solid particles called aerosols, which include such things as dust, ash, skin, salt, metals and pollen. Liquids are also present, such as water droplets when environmental conditions are right, and pollutants. In the majority of cases, aerosols are microscopic and not visible to the human eye, but where there's airflow, or has been airflow, aerosols will be present. So what does particulate matter have to do with orbs? Very basically put, where there is particulate matter in the air, even if you can't see it directly yourself, the matter creates a surface that can catch or reflect the light from a camera flash. So what you get on your image is simply the flash flare of particulate matter in the air. So let's have a quick look at the processes taking place. The process wherein light reflects off airborne particles is called backscatter. The process was documented in the 1997 book by Grimm and Grimm, the Basic Book of Photography, citing an additional problem called backscatter occurs when flashlight striking these suspended particles reflects back to the camera lens and records on the film as fuzzy white spots. Of course, backscatter can also be reduced by getting the camera as close to your subjects as possible, because the shorter the distance, the fewer number of floating particles in front of the lens. Note that this is actually referring to film photography. In 1989, the Fuji DS-X, the first full digital camera, was commercially released, but the technology didn't become popular until the mid-1990s. During the technology's early development, most photographers reported that the camera's circle of confusion was high compared to the film counterparts. And moving on to digital photography, Fuji's statement on orbs was published in July 2005, stating, "There is always a certain amount of dust floating around in the air. You may have noticed this at the movies when you look up at the light coming from a movie projector and notice the bright sparks floating around in the beam. In the same way, there are always dust particles floating around nearby when you take pictures with your camera. When you use the flash, the light from the flash reflects off the dust particles and is sometimes captured in your shot. Of course, dust particles very close to the camera are blurred since they are not in focus, but because they reflect the light more strongly than the more distant main subject of the shot, that reflected light can sometimes be captured by the camera and recorded on the resulting image as round white spots. So these dots are the blurred images of dust particles." Again, note that this was published in July 2005, 20 years ago. Now, I have just mentioned a process called the circle of confusion. The circle of confusion can be described as a point of light directed into a camera's focal plane by the lens, as quoted from masterclass.com. These points of light comprise the orb that you see. Where the circle of confusion is narrow, the point is sharp. Where the circle of confusion widens, the point blurs. The narrowness and sharpness of these points depends on a number of elements, but primarily on a camera's focal length and f-stop, neither of which were particularly advanced in the early digital models. Deliberate use of a camera's circle of confusion can be seen in bokeh photography, when usually one item or plane is sharply in focus, where another is blurred. This results in the focal point of the photograph being in sharp focus, while the background is blurred, often with light sources showing as blurred circles. So think on this. Particulate matter in the air that you can't see, moving in the airflow around you. You then take a flash photography shot, or there's a particularly strong light source in the area, and the particles themselves reflect the light back at the camera. Depending on where it is in the camera's focal plane, will depend on the circle of confusion level, and hence you get blurred balls of light appearing on your photograph of varying opacity. This of course also works with non-flash photography if there is another light source present, which could reflect off the surface of the particle. This would also depend, of course, on the material of the particle and its reflective capabilities. But even from this, we can observe that, in the early days of digital photography, it was a published fact that orbs were the results of camera artifacts, and the result of airborne particles and camera focal lengths. So where did the idea that orbs were paranormal come from? Any guesses? Yep, you probably guessed it. Paranormal entertainment on TV. In 2002, a new series aired on UK TV called Most Haunted. The show proved so popular that it became the template for almost all ghost hunting groups that sprang up at the time, despite the "for entertainment purposes only" disclaimer on the show, and one of the theories that the show presented in its early years was that orbs were paranormal in nature. Obviously, this essentially just ignored the technical data that was already published. The multitude of TV shows that followed in the footsteps of Most Haunted jumped on the paranormal orb bandwagon, which in turn led to a huge number of ghost hunting groups following suit. But why do people find it so easy to believe in a spirit orb? A lot does come down to a lack of understanding of how photography works, coupled with a lot of paranormal groups and paranormal entertainment companies still insisting that orbs are evidence of ghosts. The cynic in me says that for the entertainment contingent, they need to have something to show their paying customers. Without the customers' orbs, so to speak, they'll have nothing photographically to show for the event in most cases. The same goes for the paranormal groups and individuals who need that shred of evidence to keep their interest high. There are even those out there that are so invested in the paranormal orb phenomenon that they can make a living from interpreting their spiritual meaning. Then of course there are those that in some cases, after decades of ghost hunting and referencing orbs as evidence, simply can't or won't accept the fact, as if they did it would mean they'd been wrong for all that time. There are of course those that cling to any suggestion of an afterlife in times of grief. A ghost hunter claiming you have a spirit orb at your shoulder when you're dealing with the loss of a loved one may bring much needed comfort, while at the same time cementing the idea orbs are spirit manifestations. It can then be very difficult to accept otherwise at a later date. Personally, I would like to charitably suggest that the majority of ghost hunters out there who still promote the paranormal orb myth simply don't know enough about the photographic process, rather than anything more manipulative. Does this make things any better? That's down to the individual to decide. During research for this chapter, I undertook a simple search for paranormal orb on Google. I'd hoped to see the phenomenon debunked immediately, but the very first entry marks orbs as orbs of light are generally thought to be the manifestation of energy, which is why they're sometimes referred to as ghost orbs or spirit orbs. The second tab describes white or yellow equals nice spirits who are looking out for us, and black or red orbs indicate evil or negative spirits, or even demons that want to do us harm. Then there's 3 links to spirit orbs on YouTube. The next entry reads, while some people believe orbs are manifestations of spirits or other supernatural entities, others argue they can be explained by natural phenomena such as dust, pollen or moisture particles reflecting light, which is a little bit more hopeful before it then goes on to describe the spiritual meaning behind orbs of different colours. There's then a reference to a game where orbs are manifestations of spirits, and then finally we have a decent article entitled Orbs Debunked, and an article on backscatter. So, based on the information given on the first page of the search, which most folk will stick to, while there's some technical explanation over orbs as backscatter, and one on orbs being debunked, the majority are still clearly promoting the phenomenon as paranormal or spiritual. In fact, in the next 4 pages of the search, there are only 3 entries debunking orbs as paranormal, and research on orbs such as that undertaken by ASAP does not even appear in the first 10 pages. So at the moment, if a person is wavering in their belief on paranormal orbs, those using the internet to search for answers may well just give up before they find anything that describes the actual reason for your photographs having those lovely little glowing balls in them. So looking at these observations, we can then form a hypothesis that ghost orbs are simply caused by particulate matter reflecting light in the air. This hypothesis has been tested in a number of situations in different environments, each replicating the orb effect on camera. Photographs over years in many locations and under different conditions, with tests done on deliberate particulate photography with a multitude of camera types. Again, all show that the phenomenon can be replicated. I'll finish this chapter off with a very basic diagram showing the process of orb making at its most basic level. Here we have particulate matter in the air with a vase on the table. A photographer comes along to photograph the vase. The flash fires and reflects off particles outside of the focal point of the photograph, i.e. the vase. The image comes back with orbs caused by the out of focus dust particles. A really good example of this is the snow we seen in Newcastle, where the snow falling close to the lens was out of focus, so the snowflake takes the form of a glowing orb. And so to conclude, the question of are orbs the visual manifestation of a spirit or ghost cannot actually be directly answered. This is due to the lack of evidence for ghosts and spirits actually existing, and as such there is no method of recording their effect if they do exist on photography. However, the orb effect can be easily replicated with airborne particles reflecting light, with the process even at its most basic suggesting that orbs are simply reflections of light on particles not in focus at the time the photograph was taken. If anyone has any feedback, please feel free to get in touch. Just keep it polite and respectful please, even if you disagree with what I've just presented. Cheers!